In a quiet town, a grieving single father and a struggling mother of a disabled child cross paths by chance. Through small acts of kindness and slow healing, they create something neither expected, a home built not by blood, but by love, resilience, and the beauty of second chances. Now, before we begin, if you believe in healing, in chosen families, and the quiet magic of kindness, subscribe and let's walk this path together. The wind carried the memory of her laugh. It was early spring in the valley, when the cold still held on just enough to keep warmth a secret. The fields outside Jack Miller's farmhouse sat dry and hollow, the kind of soil that once gave life, but now only remembered it. A thin mist hung in the air, blurring the edges of everything, as though the world hadn't decided yet whether to wake up or keep sleeping. Jack rose before the sun, as he always had. The ritual of routine is only remaining compass. The kettle whistled in the quiet kitchen, steam curling up like breath from the mouth of a ghost. He didn't light the fire any more in the mornings, not since Noah had stopped waking up crying for her. The silence now was still, not sharp, just there. He drank his coffee by the window, eyes watching the same fields his father once watched. 3 years, and the grief still clung like damp clothes. It didn't scream anymore. It whispered, especially in the walls, in the places she once touched. There was a shawl still folded on the hook by the door, her handwriting still etched on the recipe card near the flour tin. Outside, the barn leaned a little more each season, and the land had grown strange. The blight came after a wet winter, stealing the root of the corn, the promise of tomatoes, the taste of sweetness from the strawberries. Jack tried. God knows he tried. But after 2 seasons of rot, he sold the plow and picked up a hammer instead. Carpentry was honest. The wood didn't betray you. It split when you asked it to. It held its weight. He heard Noah stirring upstairs and climbed the creaking steps. "Morning, Bud," Jack said gently, brushing his son's tangled hair from his forehead. Noah blinked at him, then reached for the locket he always wore, the one with her picture inside. He never opened it in front of Jack, only when he thought no one was looking. "Are we going to the motel today?" Noah asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Jack nodded, just a stair railing. "Won't take long." Noah smiled. "Can I come?" Jack hesitated. The world wasn't always kind to softness, but Noah had enough gentleness in him to fill a house. He was his mother's boy. Truly. "Yeah," Jack said, ruffling his son's hair. "You can come." The motel sat on the edge of town like a half-forgotten memory, its yellow siding faded and curling in places. It wasn't bad, just tired, the same way some people were. Jack parked his truck in the gravel lot. As he stepped out, a cold wind tugged at his collar. Noah jumped down beside him, holding his sketchbook under one arm. Drawing was his way of making sense of things. Inside, the motel office was warm and smelled faintly of burned coffee. The owner, Dave, handed Jack a clipboard. Unit 3, just a railing on the stairs. Some lady with a kid moved in there last week. Jack nodded. He didn't ask questions, just did the work. He knocked gently on the door of Unit 3. No answer at first. Then it creaked open. The woman behind it had tired eyes and a too-thin cardigan wrapped around her frame. She looked like someone who hadn't rested in years, but still stood like a storm survivor. "Hi," she said, voice tight but polite. "You hear about the steps?" Jack nodded. "Won't take long." She opened the door wider. "Come in if you need." That's when he saw the girl, 6 maybe, sitting on the floor with a stuffed rabbit in her lap. She had a halo of curly hair and a wheelchair beside her. Her arms moved with gentle, uncertain rhythm, like she was always listening to music no one else could hear. The girl saw Noah and her whole face lit up. Jack knelt beside the railing, tools clicking softly. He worked while Noah sat on the floor, not asking questions, just drawing. The little girl stared at him for a long time before inching closer. She tapped the edge of the page. Noah looked up and smiled. "Do you want me to draw you?" he asked. She didn't speak, but her head tilted ever so slightly, and she reached out, placing her stuffed rabbit in Noah's lap. Jack glanced up. The woman, her name still unspoken, was watching from the kitchenette, arms folded, guarded. "She doesn't talk," she said. "That's okay," Noah said, already sketching. Jack drove the last nail into the stair rail, stood, wiped his hands on a cloth. "Should be safe now." "Thank you," she said. Jack nodded once and turned to go. But as he opened the door, the girl's rabbit slipped from Noah's lap and tumbled to the floor. Jack caught it. When he turned, he saw something shift in the woman's face. Not trust. Not yet. But something quieter. Recognition, maybe, that this man and this boy weren't in a hurry to leave things behind. 2 days later, her car wouldn't start. Jack was driving back from town when he saw her standing beside it, the hood up, steam curling into the air. She looked small beside it, hands trembling as she cradled her daughter in a too-thin blanket. He pulled over. "Need a hand?" She looked at him like the question had come in another language. "It just won't go," she said, voice cracking. Jack looked under the hood. The smell of old oil and something burning. "Not good. I can give you a ride. If you need." She hesitated, then nodded. He helped her into the truck. Lily clutched her rabbit tight, her head resting on her mother's shoulder. Noah passed her his sketchbook to hold. She turned the pages slowly, eyes wide. Grace. He finally learned her name that night. Sat silent the whole ride. Jack didn't press. When they reached her place, she turned to him. "I didn't thank you for the stairs. And this." He only nodded. Everyone needs a hand sometimes. Before she closed the door, Noah leaned forward. "Can Lily come play sometime? We have a swing." Grace looked at Jack. He didn't say no. "We'll see," she said softly. A week passed. Jack thought about that ride more than he should have. The feel of Lily's tiny laugh in the truck. The quiet way Grace had held her, like someone who'd learned to live on alert. Then, one afternoon, Jack was fixing the porch steps when a soft voice called out behind him. "Is it okay if we stay for dinner?" He turned. Grace stood there, Lily beside her in the wheelchair, and Noah grinning behind them. "Course," Jack said, setting his tools down. "You're always welcome." Dinner was stew and cornbread. Not fancy, but warm. Grace offered help, and when she burned the bread, she laughed, a real, honest laugh that took Jack by surprise. After dinner, Grace stood by the window, looking out at the land. "What happened to your fields?" she asked. Jack wiped his hands on a towel. "Blight. Pest. Poor luck. After my wife passed, I didn't have much left to give it." Grace nodded slowly. "My father lost his farm. Same thing. Broke him. Broke my mother, too." Silence stretched between them, but not a bad one. Just two people looking at a ruin and seeing the roots. "I studied a bit. After," she added quietly, "so it wouldn't happen again." Jack looked at her. Really looked. "Maybe you could take a look." She smiled, just barely. "Maybe I could." That night, after they left, Jack sat alone on the porch. The air was cool, stars blinking in the dark like old stories. He picked up Lily's stuffed rabbit, left behind on the porch swing. He held it gently, like something sacred. The first frost came in the quiet of night. Jack woke to the sound of wind brushing against the windows like soft fingers, the way she used to wake him just before dawn. He reached out on instinct to the space where her warmth used to live, then blinked into the pale light of a new morning. The world outside was coated in a thin silver sheen. Fence posts gleamed. The porch steps whispered under his boots. The air had that hush that comes before winter properly settles in, as if everything was holding its breath. Noah was already at the kitchen table, drawing again, this time a picture of the rabbit and two swings side by side. "She smiled yesterday," he said without looking up. Jack poured coffee and sat across from him. "Lily?" Noah nodded. "When I pushed her on the swing. Just a little. She held on tight, but she smiled." Jack said nothing, but something softened in his chest, like the ground just before it thaws. Grace began to come by more often, always with Lily bundled in her lap beneath a thick plaid blanket. She never came empty-handed. A jar of jam she'd bartered for, a cloth bag of winter greens. Her hands were always busy, peeling, sewing, helping, but her eyes stayed cautious, like someone who'd once trusted the wrong silence. Jack gave her space. They worked the land together in slow, careful steps. Grace brought books, circled passages in pencil. She crouched beside the earth, touched it like a pulse, listened to it the way some folks listen to the ocean. "It's not dead," she said once, running her fingers through a patch of hardened soil. "It's just waiting." Jack watched her then, as her hair caught the wind, and he thought maybe people were like that too. Inside, the farmhouse began to feel different. Lily's laughter echoed through the halls on Thursdays when she and Noah played marbles by the wood stove. Grace's voice, once guarded and clipped, began to soften around the edges. She started staying after supper. Not always, but sometimes. Washing dishes with sleeves rolled up, reading aloud to Lily in the living room, while Noah dozed off beside them. Jack stayed quiet most nights, sanding at the table, stealing glances when he thought they wouldn't notice. Once, Grace caught him watching. She didn't speak, but she didn't look away either, just offered a small, tired smile that said, "I see you too." One evening, as the fire crackled low and the children slept, Jack pulled an old tin from the high cupboard. Inside were letters, his wife's handwriting still etched in soft curves, blue ink faded at the edges. He hadn't read them in years. He held one between his fingers, then paused. Grace sat across from him, darning a sock. "I kept them," he said, his voice low. "Not because I couldn't let go. Just, I didn't want to forget how she saw me." Grace looked up. "Sometimes," she said, after a long moment, "holding on to a thing isn't weakness. It's how we remember who we are." Jack looked down at the letter again, then placed it gently back in the tin. "Thank you," he said. Grace nodded. No more needed to be said. Winter came early that year. Snow arrived on a Wednesday, blanketing the valley in a hush so deep even the birds grew still. Jack woke to the roof groaning under its weight, the farmhouse swaddled in white. He bundled Noah in his thickest coat and built a small sled from an old drawer. They carved paths through the snow, laughing until their cheeks burned pink. Grace arrived just before dusk, her cheeks flushed, Lily wrapped tight in a hand-knit scarf. Jack met her at the porch, his breath curling between them. "Road's too slick," he said. "You'll stay here tonight." Grace hesitated only a moment, then nodded. That night, they made soup from root vegetables and cornbread again, and Grace brought out a deck of old playing cards. They played by candlelight, laughter echoing in warm waves. Later, Jack found her sitting by the window, looking out over the moonlit fields. Lily slept beside her, her small hand wrapped around the rabbit's ear. Grace didn't turn when Jack stepped in. "My parents used to say snow was a kind of forgiveness," she said quietly. "A clean start." Jack leaned against the frame, arms folded. "Maybe that's what we're all waiting for." Grace nodded. "Maybe." They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. The following week, Jack found Lily's sketch on the fridge. A crayon drawing, 4 stick figures beneath a tree, Jack, Grace, Noah, and Lily, in her small, unsteady scrawl. She'd written one word beneath it, home. He touched the paper gently, then left it right where it was. When the new year came, Jack built a small greenhouse from salvaged wood and old windows. Grace helped him plant the first seeds. Spinach, kale, hope. They worked in silence, their hands brushing sometimes, their eyes meeting longer now. One afternoon, Grace brought a letter. "It's from a friend at the bank. I told her about the land, about trying again." Jack stared at it. "I haven't asked for help in a long time." "I know," Grace said, "but maybe this isn't about asking. Maybe it's about believing we're worth saving." He read it slowly, Alone. A chance. His hands trembled slightly as he folded the paper. "You're not just helping the land," he said quietly. Grace smiled and for the first time didn't look away. "Neither are you." Late one evening, after the kids had fallen asleep beside the fire, Grace stepped into the kitchen to find Jack placing 2 mugs of tea on the table. She sat across from him, her eyes tired but warm. Jack reached into the old tin again and pulled out a letter, not from his wife this time, but one he'd written and never sent. He unfolded it, voice soft. It was for Noah. "I wrote it the night she died. Never knew when to give it to him." Grace listened as he read. "Dear Noah, if you're reading this, it means you've grown into someone strong enough to carry pieces of her with you. That laugh, that light, you were always her reason. And now you're mine. Love, always, Dad." Silence wrapped around them like a blanket. Grace reached across the table, her fingers gently touching his. "You gave him more than words," she whispered. "You gave him a way forward." Jack looked at her, really looked. So much sorrow lived in both of them. But so did Grace. Outside, the snow began to fall again, gentle and steady, like it knew it was laying a path. Inside, Lily stirred in her sleep, her rabbit still clutched tight. Jack poured Grace another cup of tea. She smiled quietly. This time, she stayed until morning. The first thaw came slowly, not with fanfare or sunbursts, but in the smallest places, beneath the eaves, where a single droplet broke free and fell, over and over, until even the silence gave way to its rhythm. Grace stood at the kitchen sink, her hands plunged in warm water, watching the icicles melt like tears along the edge of the barn roof. Behind her, Lily laughed, deep, full, unguarded. It came from the living room, where Noah had somehow taught her to balance building blocks on a pillow without knocking them over. Grace listened, unmoving. She hadn't heard her daughter laugh like that in years. Jack built a raised bed by the side of the house. Not for crops, just flowers. Grace had found a packet of seeds in the back of the cupboard. Old, maybe expired. Daisies, marigolds, something wild she couldn't name. She handed them to Jack with a shrug, not expecting much. He took them like she was handing him something sacred. That's how he was with small things. Quiet reverence, like every detail deserved to matter. A cup washed clean, a knot in wood, a child's drawing taped carefully to the fridge. It had been a long time since someone treated her offerings like they were enough. In early March, Jack brought home a box of books from the local thrift shop, mostly children's stories. But one sat at the bottom, worn and spine-cracked, The Old Man and the Sea. "I used to read this to Noah when he couldn't sleep," Jack said, holding it in his hands like memory. He didn't say why he'd stopped. Grace took it from him, thumbed gently through the pages. "You should read it again." So he did, that night, slowly, quietly. Lily fell asleep halfway through. Noah curled up with his head against Grace's arm. Jack's voice was low, sure, steady, the kind of sound that filled up a room without asking for permission. That was the night they didn't say goodnight, didn't separate into different corners of the house. They stayed by the fire until dawn bruised the sky. April came with wind and wild hope. They planted rows of spinach and carrots, retilled the back acre with cautious optimism. Grace brought out the journal she kept from her father's farming days, small notes and careful sketches from a man who had taught her how to read soil like a story. She and Jack leaned over the pages together. Side by side, 2 griefs laid gently beside one another, not erased but known. "You remember all this?" he asked once, watching her outline a planting schedule on a paper bag. She looked up, smiled faintly. "I remember what mattered." He nodded. "That's all that counts." The kids built a fort out of old sheets and laundry baskets on the front porch. They named it the Wonder House. Noah let Lily hold the flashlight. She read to him in her own soft rhythm, syllables slow but sure, every word a victory. Her little fingers trembled sometimes, but she never stopped trying. Jack stood just out of sight, hand resting on the porch beam, watching. He had no words for what it meant. Seeing his boy, once so quiet and alone, laugh with his whole face. Seeing Lily, fragile and fierce, shine. Grace came up beside him, a steaming mug in each hand. She passed him one without a word. They stood there, shoulder to shoulder, two watchers of something holy. One morning, Jack found Lily's rabbit on the windowsill. Sunlight spilled over it, soft and golden. Its ears were bent, fur matted from years of being held close. Grace saw him reach for it and paused. "She's had that since the hospital," she said quietly. "When she was born, they didn't know if—" Her voice faltered. She held it when the tubes were too big and the room was too loud. Jack looked at the small toy, then gently placed it back, like it belonged to the light. "She's strong," he said. "She has to be," Grace replied. "She's mine." By late spring, something green and stubborn broke through the earth. Jack knelt beside the sprout, fingers brushing dirt from its tender leaves. Grace crouched beside him. "I didn't think they'd grow," he whispered. "They just needed time," she said. They sat in silence, the sun warming their backs. In the distance, the children's laughter echoed again. "Do you think—" Jack started, then stopped. Grace waited. "Do you think you'll stay?" It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't even a request. Just a fragile hope, spoken aloud like a wish to a quiet sky. Grace didn't answer right away, but her hand found his. Later that week, Noah brought home a school project, a drawing, for stick figures again. This time, the house had flowers. The field was green. And above them all, a small bluebird hovered mid-flight. Jack looked at the drawing, his throat tight. Grace picked it up, studied it. "He drew wings," she murmured. Noah nodded. "For her." He pointed to the figure with a rabbit in her hand. "So she can fly too." Jack looked at his son, and then at Lily, who beamed proud. They weren't broken things anymore. They were growing. On the first warm evening of June, they laid a blanket out under the stars. Noah fell asleep with his head on Jack's chest. Lily curled up in Grace's lap, rabbit still tucked close. Fireflies blinked across the field. The wind was gentle, the sky endless. Grace looked at Jack, her voice soft as wind through wheat. "I thought I'd lost everything." Jack didn't speak, just reached over, took her hand, and placed something in it. "A key. It's not a ring," he said quietly, "but it opens this house, and every room in it." Grace stared at it, eyes stinging. She didn't say yes. She didn't have to. Later, when the kids were inside and the fire had burned low, Grace found her journal again. She opened it to a blank page and wrote, not in neat notes or far measurements, but a single line across the top: "Things grow where love is planted." She placed the journal on the windowsill beside the rabbit and turned out the light. The first leaf fell the morning Grace hung wind chimes outside the kitchen window. It was the softest sound, a single, silver note drifting into the silence. The kind of sound you only notice when everything else stood still. Jack was sanding a beam on the porch. Noah was helping Lily untangle her shoelaces by the steps. The sky wore a pale gold, the air just beginning to taste of cinnamon and firewood. Grace looked out over the yard that had once been hollow and brown and tired. It looked lived in now. It looked held. In the living room, above the fireplace, hung a framed photograph. A quiet one. No posed smiles, no fanfare. Just Jack, kneeling in the garden with soil on his palms. Lily in his lap, pointing at something blooming. Noah leaning on Grace's shoulder, looking, not at the camera, but at them. It had been taken by a neighbor who stopped by for eggs. Grace had cried when she saw it. Not loudly, just one hand to her mouth. A stillness, like she had finally seen something she'd once only dreamed about. A real family. One not built by blood, but by choice, and care, and time. They fixed up the barn that winter. Not because they had to, but because Jack said it might be nice for the kids to give them something to build with their own hands. So Noah helped paint the door sea blue. Lily helped plant pots of lavender outside the threshold. Jack rewired the old light bulbs, and Grace lined the walls with old quilts and shelves made from spare planks. They called it the Heart Room. It had no real purpose, no cows, no tools. Just a table with 4 mismatched chairs, a kettle, some board games, books, a wood stove in the corner that ticked when it got too hot. It became their ritual space. Evenings were quieter there. You could hear the snow falling if you listened close enough. One evening in December, the power went out. No wind, no storm, just a silence that swallowed the light. Lily got scared first. Then Noah, who tried to act brave. Jack found candles. Grace lit them slowly, one by one, her hand steady, her voice calm. They sat on the floor around the coffee table. Jack pulled out an old deck of cards. Grace made up story for each one. The Queen of Hearts was a baker, the Ace of Spades a wandering knight. Noah laughed until he hiccuped. Lily leaned against Jack's side. Safe. No one said it out loud, but they didn't want the lights to come back on. Not just yet. A week before Christmas, Lily said her first full sentence. It was cold outside, and Jack had just helped her tie her scarf. "Thank you for making me warm," she said. Soft, clear, certain. Jack froze. Tears sprang to his eyes before he could stop them. Grace turned from the sink and covered her mouth. Lily looked confused. Jack knelt. His voice broke when he whispered, "You make all of us warm, sweetheart." Lily beamed. The rabbit clutched tight to her chest. Grace excused herself and cried quietly in the hallway, not out of sadness, but because, for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of hope. That same week, Jack found a letter he hadn't opened. It was buried in a drawer, beneath old bills and instructions for a crib he never took apart. The envelope was addressed in his late wife's handwriting, dated 2 weeks before she passed. He opened it slowly, fingers trembling like they did when he worked too long in the cold. Inside, a few short lines. "If you're reading this, you're still here. Thank you for staying. Don't let Noah grow up thinking love has to leave. Show him what staying looks like." He folded the letter and placed it back in the drawer. He didn't tell Grace. But that night, as she stood by the stove, brushing flour from her hands, he walked over and kissed her temple. She didn't ask why. She just reached for his hand and held on. New Year's came gently. No fireworks, just cider in chipped mugs and a blanket spread across the front porch. They watched the stars blink into the black. Grace rested her head on Jack's shoulder. Noah whispered his resolutions. Build a treehouse. Be nicer to Lily. Learn how to make real pancakes. Lily's were simpler. She wanted to learn to ride the tricycle, without help. Jack's were unspoken. But as he looked at them, these people would come into his life not like lightning, but like sunrise. He whispered one thing under his breath. Let it last. Spring again. The soil was ready. Grace planted new seeds, not just in the ground, but in her calendar. She enrolled Lily in a music class in town. She took on part-time bookkeeping for the feed store. She even joined a grief support circle on Thursday nights, something she once thought she'd never need again. Jack fixed the roof, built Noah a treehouse, started carving small wooden birds in the evenings, painting each one with a different shade of sky. He left one on Grace's pillow with a note. For every day you stayed, for every time you made it feel like home. One afternoon, Grace's hands shook. She was baking bread, something her mother used to do when the house felt too quiet. Her kneading slowed. Her breath caught. Jack came in and found her sitting on the floor, flour on her cheek, tears sliding silently down. He didn't ask. He just sat beside her, pulled her gently into his chest, and let her cry. They stayed like that, bread forgotten, until Lily toddled in with Noah and announced that the rabbit needed a blanket because it was cold in its ears. They laughed, just enough to breathe again. May brought birds. They nested under the eaves, above the window where the wind chimes still sang. Grace would sit with Lily every morning and point to each one. "That one's Mama." She'd say, "That one's you." Lily never asked about her father anymore. Not since she started calling Jack Papa in her sleep. The first time it happened, Jack had been carrying her to bed. Her voice, barely a whisper, tucked into the space between dream and waking. He sat up most of that night, staring at the ceiling, hands in his lap. When Grace found him, she didn't say anything. She just wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and sat down beside him. By summer, the garden bloomed like forgiveness, tomatoes heavy on the vine, lavender brushing against sun-warmed skin. Noah made up names for each section: the laughter row, the secret smile patch, the brave corner. Lily picked wildflowers and pressed them in old books. Grace hung strings of them in the windows, petals like little suns. Jack watched her from the porch one evening. As golden light danced across her face, she looked over at him. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to. The wedding wasn't planned. Not really. It was a Tuesday. The preacher was in town delivering feed, and Jack, without thinking, just asked, "Would you stay for supper?" And then, "Would you stay long enough to help us make this forever?" Grace said yes with tears in her eyes, flower on her cheek, and Lily asleep in her lap. Noah handed her a dandelion as a bouquet. Jack didn't wear a suit. Grace wore a dress she'd sewn herself. They said vows under the old tree in the yard, where the first daisy had bloomed a year before. That night, after everyone had gone, they sat again on the porch, Lily in her new white shoes, asleep in Grace's arms. Noah half dozing beside Jack. Stars above, crickets below. Jack pulled something from his pocket. It was a small wooden heart. On one side, carved initials. On the other, a phrase, "Things grow where love is planted." He pressed it into Grace's palm and closed her fingers over it. She looked at him, then down at the quiet house behind them, and whispered, "We're home, aren't we?" Jack nodded, voice low. "We always were. We just didn't know it yet." If this story touched your heart, subscribe. There are more like these to follow.